Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar in the series on the future of humanitarian aid. My name is Ruth Mukwana. I am the Helen Hamlin Senior Fellow and Director of Graduate Studies at Fordham's Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs. The Institute was created over 25 years ago to educate current and future humanitarian workers. The Institute offers academic graduate programs, a bachelor's in humanitarian studies, a master of science in humanitarian studies, and in the fall of this year, is excited to launch a master of arts in humanitarian studies, a fully online program. The Institute also conducts research, convenes conferences, meetings to engage on topical humanitarian issues. The Institute also has a gallery and press. Today, our guest to speak on the future of humanitarian aid is Mr. Juan Chaves-Gonzalez. Juan is a political scientist with over 20 years of experience in conflict prevention, peace building, development, and humanitarian action. He is the lead advisor for crisis risk financing at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and advisor on the future to the Emergency Relief Coordinator. Juan is also part of OCHA's Climate and Innovation section, where he develops financing solutions to make humanitarian response more efficient and adaptive. He has also worked on peace building and recovery in his home country, Colombia, and writes on humanitarian ethics, innovation, climate, and humanitarian finance. Juan, it's really a pleasure to have you join us today, and I will hand over to you to share your perspectives and the work you're working on the future of humanitarian aid.
Ruth, thank you so much. We are former colleagues, and I am delighted to see you, and congrats on your role at Fordham. It's really fantastic to see such a strong colleague with your experience taking on that role. It is really lovely to be here. I will try to keep my remarks fairly brief. I'm really curious about the questions on your mind and the kind of the direction of the conversation that you would like to take in the next webinar. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about my current role as advisor on the future to Tom Fletcher, the UN's relief chief and head of OCHA. Tom launched an initiative soon after he took on his position as emergency relief coordinator to basically recruit people from within the UN who could help imagine what humanitarian aid would look like in the next decades. And I put my name forward basically with an idea that draws inspiration from Audrey Tang. For those of you who are not familiar with Audrey Tang, she's someone I highly recommend researching. She was the first digital minister of Taiwan and currently a cyber ambassador for Taiwan. And a few decades ago, when she was still a young computer hacker, she played a role in mobilizing youths in Taiwan and in fact hacking and live streaming conversations that were happening inside Taiwan's parliament on very sensitive issues for the Taiwanese society pertaining to labor law and free trade agreements with China that were impinging on workers' rights. And instead of simply protesting, Audrey decided to engage. So to move from from enragement to engagement, and to enable people to participate in real time in those debates that were happening behind closed doors by submitting questions and by putting pressure on their parliamentarians on the issues they cared about. And this gave way to a technology that has been evolving over the last few years to enable people to practice democracy at scale through civic engagement, and to counteract the negative impact of social media through pro-social media, where people can participate in heated debates, but where the algorithm essentially rewards consensus as opposed to division, and where the conversation stays focused on people's views on a given issue and not so much on targeting people because of the views they hold. So at the time when Tom Fletcher launched this initiative, I happened to be sort of exploring this connection between democracy and humanitarian aid, and whether the new generations of humanitarians are going to have to maybe use different and new tools to keep solidarity democratic, anchored in values, anchored in a cosmopolitan view that people deserve assistance regardless who they are, where they are, and what their religion or race might be. So that was my sort of inspiration to put my name forwards. I was also thinking that the connection between democracy and technology and democracy and machines is not something necessarily new. Doing a little bit of research, I discovered, for instance, that the Greeks had invented a device, a machine called the Clerotarion, to basically enable citizens to make decisions in a fair and random way on critical issues such as what citizen should serve as a public servant on a given post. And the Greeks in Athens would use sometimes multiple of these Clerotarion machines, which were very interesting contraptions made out of stone, wood, and bronze, where they would actually use machines to check on the results produced by other machines. So I mean, if you are interested in that kind of stuff, I recommend also researching a little bit about the history of machines in democracy. So I reached out to the Computational Democracy Project, which is one of the organizations founded by Audrey Tang, to see if we could use an open source platform to enable people from all over the world to start sharing their views and concerns about the future of humanitarian aid, and essentially enable the relief chief, Tom Fletcher, not only to have a channel for broadcasting his views and for communicating with the humanitarian movement, but also to listen closely to what people care about, where they want to take humanitarianism in the future, what concerns them right now, and to also democratize the space, democratize the conversation. So it's no secret the past period and the current moment we're in is very challenging. There's been lots of consequences as a result of shifts, geopolitical shifts that are resulting in massive funding cuts and different sorts of pressures with oftentimes lethal consequences for people who are overnight unable to receive the assistance they need to survive. But so the question is, who does the future belong to? Who needs to make decisions about where we go from here? Do we want to maintain a conclave approach to decision making in the humanitarian sector, where the usual institutions, the usual actors, the usual donors get to make decisions about where we go from here? Or do we open up the space and do we enable everyone who's in fact concerned or moved by an impulse of solidarity to take part in the conversation. So with that in mind, I reached out to this group that I mentioned, the Computational Democracy Project, to learn about how we could use their platform, their digital platform for civic engagement, to basically ask people what they think the future of humanitarian should look like. How do we rebuild global solidarity? And what does successful humanitarian action look like by the year 2035? And we published the listening channel on OCHA's website to essentially start asking people this question. And what is really interesting about this platform is that it's not a survey. It's not it's not the usual instrument where a researcher controls the questionnaire and in what order the questions are asked. There's practically no control. People decide what they want to talk about, and the more that people participate, the more the conversation starts to converge around areas of consensus and reveal areas where people have disagreement. So that is essentially what the listening channel enables. Collecting views, deciding the content of the conversation, and deciding the direction of the conversation about the future of humanitarianism. So we've had roughly 10,000 votes on this platform on approximately 230 to 250 different issues, different ideas that people have shared. And people have voted on those ideas, whether agreeing, disagreeing, or not being sure and simply passing on them. A crucial aspect of how the tool works, before I get into the substance and tell you a little bit about what we're hearing through the channel, is that it leverages existing technology. So anyone, anywhere in the world can go into the listening channel, and they will see the channel in the language of their browser. So it's multilingual. There's no language barrier, or at least it is highly diminished. It's also anonymous. So participation on this platform does not identify anybody by name. And that means that the focus is squarely on content and not on people. It doesn't matter if you are a UN official, a government official, a student, a practitioner, a victim, a beneficiary, or just a regular citizen. Titles don't matter. And I think that's actually quite brilliant for this initiative, because Tom Fletcher, when he began his current job, felt somewhat uncomfortable with the lingo that we typically use in our sector. We tend to refer to the humanitarian space as a system, and he was pushing a little bit against that notion of our sector just being a system and instead becoming a movement. And so the key thing for any movement is that the entry bar has to be very low. You should not necessarily have to be an expert to be part of a movement. You can just be someone whose conscience is somehow moved by the cause of the movement. And the second thing that was intriguing to me was, well, the word movement itself implies moving from something that you want to change to a new place that you think is better. So in that journey, I think, a movement that is open to everybody should enable to capture views that are not necessarily those of only the experts. Now, as we have run the channel, we have begun to basically see groups forming, four groups forming around different core ideas. We've seen some pragmatic reformers. These are people who would like to see incremental institutional change. They are very cautious about radical ideas, but they are not content with the status quo. There's a second group that we have called skeptical realists. These are people who are problem focused and very skeptical of overpromising solutions. And maybe you can start sort of thinking which group you belong to. Sometimes I feel like I belong to all of these groups, depending on the day of the week. There's a third group called idealist innovators. These are people who are proposing on the listening channel bolder reform, tech-enabled solutions, a faster adoption of AI for humanitarian assistance, for example. And then finally, there's a group that we have called system-wide transformers. So people who basically align themselves with the idea that structural change is required, but that structural change needs to be managed and somehow aligned with things like the humanitarian reset and the UN-OCHA reform process. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A segment. The major shifts that people have identified are basically on the structural front. People would like to see humanitarian aid being more decentralized, and also more integrated, less fragmented humanitarian assistance. People want to also move away on the financing side of things from charity to capital, and with also less silos. People are affected by conflict, by climate change, by structural poverty, by emergencies. So where the money comes from is ultimately less relevant for people affected. What matters is that all that financing architecture is engineered or re-engineered to enable growth in a time of materially scarce resources, and to be delivered as efficiently as possible. There's also a big push in the listening channel for real-time transparency, for more anticipatory action, for more digital cash transfers, and essentially for more assistance that is empowering, so that people meet disaster on their own terms, and where essentially we are boosting people's agency, as opposed to the more traditional assistantialism that has predominated in humanitarian aid. And then there's also a couple more shifts. One is more normative. So there's a shift away from aid dependency to resilience, from charity to solidarity, and from decolonization to plurality. And a final shift that is quite obvious, an area of consensus, is that we must maintain our values, our humanitarian values, protected from geopolitical dynamics. So whether that is codified in the way that funding flows for humanitarian aid, or whether that means continuing to push for political consensus around protected humanitarian corridors and humanitarian access. There has to be a way of essentially not compromising on the values of solidarity, and the fact that funding can be oftentimes a material problem, that it can be scarce, does not mean that we should that we should be morally scarce as well. So this is not a time of moral scarcity, and I think there's a very loud voice in the listening channel to preserve values. There's a few recommendations that participants in the channel have made to Tom Fletcher as a relief chief. Number one, to offer more clarity on localization, better principles for monitoring, and more cross-sectoral coordination amongst people delivering assistance. Number two, people want to see a scale-up of anticipatory action that is not waiting for needs to arise or for disasters to happen to start responding, but a system that is more driven by shifts in risk, where we use forecasts and data to essentially trigger assistance before events happen or before people are in dire, severe need. They are also recommending the implementation of more transparency initiatives, being fully transparent on funding flows, being fully transparent on who's doing what, where, and also who is participating in the humanitarian effort, and whether decisions are being made top down in a centralized way by international staff who are deployed to be the heads of organizations on the ground, or if decisions are being made truly by local communities, local organizations, local governments. In the long term, one of the main recommendations to the relief chief is to recognize that humanitarian aid is by nature short term. We are the firefighters in the multilateral system, but that doesn't mean that we should think short term when it comes to humanitarian assistance. We need capital mobilization, we need sector integration, and we need sustained diplomatic protection mechanisms. So there's a really strong push from participants to focus on some of these issues. So let me conclude my remarks by basically inviting you to participate in the listening channel. There will be a link posted on the chat where you can access it. In the next few months, we will be producing a report that basically shows the opinion map and gives even more detail. I know that I have just given you a very coarse overview of the listening channel, but you will be able to see all the individual statements and how people voted on each of those. So that's going to be published also very soon. And also the data is going to be public, so not just the report, but researchers, and I know that many of you will be interested in doing this, will be able to access the raw data and run your own analysis and use it for your own research purposes. So we encourage more people who can actually help us make sense of this data, and not just from OCHA's institutional perspective, but from your own fully independent point of view. And then I think we also want to continue to track the extent to which these ideas are being translated into practice. And one of the resources that I would point you towards is Tom Fletcher's Humanifesto. So in fact, the listening channel is basically the other side of a coin, where Tom Fletcher publishes a Humanifesto every couple of weeks or so, talking about what he has been up to and what is coming up next, and what kind of questions and what kind of engagements are inspiring some of the work we are doing as we try to fight for the renewal of the system. And you will see, hopefully, that there is a direct dialogue between some of the decisions and some of the postures and positions that are being taken and defended and promoted from the UN relief chief, and the kind of input and voices that are being expressed on the listening channel, but also through his direct engagements when he travels to crisis-affected places. So I think I would prefer to stop here and hand the floor back to the moderators, to you, Ruth, for any questions that people may have. And obviously, I'm also open to discuss any other questions, not necessarily related to my presentation, but just in general, if you are curious about what's going on in the humanitarian space, I will try to at least give you responses, if not answers. So thank you so much again for giving me this fantastic opportunity.
Thank you so much, Juan. Lots to think about. I still haven't decided whether I fall in the bucket of pragmatic reformers, skeptical realists, idealist innovators, or system-wide transformers. This is the time to post your questions in the Q&A. It's open. I'll be monitoring it. And as I wait for participants to think through their questions, we have a few that came in prior. And actually, there's one already here. I will read it for you, Juan. Do you have a sense of how communities that are themselves at the receiving end of humanitarian efforts are or not able to contribute to this platform that you're managing?
We do have a sense. I'll be honest, most of the participation so far on the channel has been from the usual suspects. But and that is both expected, but it's also personally frustrating because I would like to see more plurality on the channel. But I do cherish a few participants who are actually from grassroots communities and organizations, including, for instance, in Somalia. I am in close contact right now with a group of youths in humanitarian aid in Somalia who have been engaging also Tom Fletcher directly. And I was really pleased to see their contributions and their views on the channel. So that's just one example. But as I said, I can only guess also based on the actual wording of some of the comments that are received and entered through the channel, because of course this platform being anonymous doesn't allow us to properly identify who is participating and who's not participating. But I can definitely see that judging from the wording, the very technical, sometimes very specialized language that people use, that most of the inputs are coming from usual suspects. The good news, though, is that it's not all coming from the UN. So at the very least, we do see lots of participation from non-UN organizations, and that means that in that sense, the channel serves a purpose. People who cannot necessarily directly speak to the UN relief chief are finding the channel at least a somewhat useful avenue for making their voices heard. Okay, let me stop there. I'm sure that there will be more questions. More ideas are coming to my mind, but I just don't want to monopolize the mic.
Thank you, Juan. And this is a question, and it's one of those that actually, in some of the recommendations that are coming through the listening channel, you may also be able to pull on to answer. But the question is, how do we navigate between dwindling national and international funding for humanitarian work and the ever-increasing critical humanitarian needs?
Okay, so there's different types of ways of answering that question. And I, at the risk of sounding, of romanticizing the response, I think the first thing we need to think about is our moral choice. What kind of moral choice do we make in this current moment? We have to recognize reality as it is. We're probably expecting a 40% decrease in overall funding for humanitarian assistance by the end of this year. So it is a really, really challenging moment. At the same time, governments are facing impossible fiscal choices. They are having, they are the debt burden on many of the countries who are most severely affected by humanitarian crisis need to struggle between using whatever money they have on their budgets to provide basic services to their people or towards debt service. So the fiscal choices are tough. The capacity of the system has been affected massively by funding cuts. So I think we should not deny reality, but I do think that we should ask ourselves, what's the moral choice that we have to make right now? And I think the moral choice should be to create the financial capacity, to create the political support, to create the institutional capacity required to deliver solidarity at scale, not to adjust our moral choice or the size of our moral ambition to the size of the available funding, because that would essentially put us in a path of managing decline as opposed to creating the necessary amount of political and financial will required to continue to deliver humanitarian aid. So I think the first response would be make a morally ambitious choice to continue to fight for humanitarian action. Then there's a more technical set of responses to that question, which have to do with financial creativity. I think that has been lacking in the humanitarian space. Other sectors of society have been successful at leveraging financial knowledge and financial innovation to stretch and manage resources according to the outcomes that they want to achieve and the human welfare or fiscal benefit they want to create. As humanitarians, we've not done that just yet. Our financial model or funding model remains relatively archaic in two fundamental ways. Number one, it's a fully grant dependent type of model. We depend on donations, and as we are seeing right now, donations are volatile. The willingness of rich people to give is exactly that. It's willingness, and for reasons that we may agree with or disagree with, that willingness fluctuates. It's volatile. We cannot have a system that depends exclusively on grants. The second fundamental way in which our funding model is limited is in terms of short-termism. We mobilize funding every year, but we're not very successful at creating capital that grows over the years. So I do see a lot on the listening channel on this topic. People who are from outside the humanitarian space asking, why are you not doing for humanitarian assistance what others have done for, let's say, development action, where you can actually get funding from donors and invest some of that in both public and private capital markets, use the returns on investment to continue to expand and grow the pot. So those are the two answers right now. I think there's a moral choice to not reduce the size of our ambition just because the funding is going down. And then there's a technical challenge that we need to embrace, and we need to accelerate quite rapidly this transition from a grant-made model to a capital-based model that is proactive, that is linked to technology, that is linked to data, that enables more transparent decision-making, more efficient use of resources, more return on investment. So I think, that's kind of hard to compute sometimes, because on the one hand, humanitarianism is a bit of a social technology that should belong to that should be owned socially. So I think when we talk about financing, it's very, very easy to start sounding as a capitalist, right? And so I know that that's kind of problematic, but removing the ideological considerations from the debate, there is a case for simply managing the financing model more efficiently and better, because at the end of the day, it's about delivering what people need. And that requires an efficient way of use of resources, regardless of whether we are going through a moment of scarcity or a moment of abundance. So I think, that could be probably one of the paradoxes of this current crisis, that perhaps we re-emerge a little bit wiser on how we manage our financing.
Thank you so much, Juan, for that. And here's another question, which is basically, and I'll expand it, but the question is, how is your experience so far, the information you're gathering through the listening channel, translating into action for OCHA's architecture? But I suppose I would expand that out for the broader humanitarian architecture in terms of, are you getting actionable input that actually now is being used to inform the humanitarian architecture?
So let me start by the last part of your question. I think it would be desirable to have more concrete proposals on the channel, more actionable, practical proposals. But I'm also not very worried about that. I think it's also really interesting to see the channel being used as a way of signposting the direction for the sector. And so that means that oftentimes the comments we get are more normative. They're more about how people are feeling, and also sometimes very harsh critiques about the work of the UN, or political deadlock, or institutional inability to rise up to the challenge. There's all sorts of views, as one might expect. So if you are interested in participating, feel free to participate in whatever way you feel you want to participate. And if you want to propose something very concrete, then we are definitely in the market for concrete ideas. Now, direct link between input and action is quite clear. I think I have the privilege of being an insider and seeing how, for example, some of the conversations around the implementation of the humanitarian reset, which is this big reactive reform that was stood up last year in the sector to try to cope with the new reality. A lot of the input from the listening channel has been informing some of the choices that we make collectively in how we go about implementing the humanitarian reset, including, for example, becoming a more transparent sector, becoming a more cooperative sector. So there have been some suggestions, either concrete or philosophical, that have been translated into principles for action or concrete activities as part of the humanitarian agencies that are cooperating around the humanitarian reset. So that's encouraging. I think that's really quite encouraging. And even if there's no direct response from the humanitarian relief chief, right? Even if Tom Fletcher is not directly speaking back to someone and saying, "Thank you for that great idea. This is what I have done." It is all being taken into consideration. And in fact, in some cases, you will, those of you who participate will be able to identify in his public remarks and speeches and engagements with the media and interviews that a lot of that is being picked up and used both in his communications as well as in his decisions and in the way that he proposes issues for discussion with other humanitarian leaders.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And there's this question, and again, I don't know if, it's something that people participating in the listening channels have commented on, but it's really about the US's government decision to change its approach to support UN humanitarian aid programs. And I think the comment there is that it seems the US State Department is trying to treat OCHA itself as a prime contractor, which seems to reinforce the centralization of aid, which is contrary to some of the decentralization models that participants are calling for, and just asking for your thoughts or comments on that.
My comments are exactly the comments that you have heard from the Secretary General, from Tom Fletcher, where the basic fact that there is, again, significant funding from the historically most generous humanitarian donor flowing back into the system. That's good news. That's just going to save millions of lives. So from a purely pragmatic standpoint, I think, but also from a moral standpoint, I think it is really good news that the US has decided to re-engage with humanitarian assistance, and that they are doing that in a meaningful way, and the volume of funding that they are re-injecting into the system speaks for itself. So I think I will stay away from engaging in a debate around ideology, because fundamentally humanitarian action is about principles. It's about impartial, neutral humanitarian assistance. And so that funding is enabling the humanitarian community to deliver assistance in a principled way. I think the US has recognized and also supported the fact that humanitarian action needs to be principled. So even though they have been very clear about the countries where they would like their funding to be used for, they have fully respected that decision-making on how that money is used remains anchored in existing arrangements. The reason the funding is flowing, or a lot of that funding is flowing through OCHA, first, does not mean that OCHA is being funded. OCHA is not necessarily growing or making money as an organization or as an entity of the United Nations. We are basically channeling that money through existing humanitarian pooled funds. A lot of those pooled funds are country-based pooled funds, where local communities, NGOs get to participate in the prioritization and the programming of humanitarian assistance. The decisions are ultimately made by humanitarian coordinators, who are the top officials at the country level. But the process through which decisions are being made is fundamentally an inclusive process. I will say one more thing for full transparency, which is that for the first tranche of the US award that was announced on the 29th of December of 2025, there was an agreement to implement that money very quickly, within 6 months. And I think that was by design, to also demonstrate that we are a system that functions and that is able and capable of very quickly absorbing and translating generous donations into humanitarian assistance. For the second tranche, the duration of the implementation period will be extended. And that is on purpose, also to ensure that we allow smaller organizations who require a little bit more time to participate and benefit from this funding directly. So that is what I imagine we will see. What was announced recently in that joint press conference with the US ambassador to the UN, the USG of the State Department for Humanitarian Assistance, and Tom Fletcher, was that this model is working, that there's transparency in how the funds are being utilized and at what speed they are being allocated, and that the extra time that has now been allowed in the second award is going to enable more participation of local and national NGOs. So we have not given up on localization. We have not given up on principled delivery of humanitarian assistance, and the injection of funding from the US is being done according to those two beacons, to those guiding ideals for the sector. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Juan. And I'll be very curious if we had all the different, the pragmatic reformers, skeptical realists, idealist innovators, and system-wide transformers, if we had them on this webinar to listen to their thoughts on this kind of question that is actually quite pertinent. And I think we have maybe a question for one more or two. One of these is really for those who have people in our lives that are vulnerable to political retribution, when is it safe for us to be a voice in the advocacy conversation? I think I would expand it out. And if you can, Juan, maybe just to share a little bit how the different ways people can actually advocate and at the same time maybe be safe.
Look, it's a really tough choice. I think it's almost a spiritual question, and I am humbled by it. I don't think that I can give any sort of definitive answer on it. I think for those of us who have had the privilege of working in humanitarian aid, nothing is more inspiring than the courage of people who are closer to the front lines, but also people in communities. Nobody's waiting for somebody from the outside to decide to help a neighbor. That's something that is primarily pre-existing in people's hearts. And when I see real life examples of that translated into action, then that is just tremendously inspiring. What you see happening, for instance, in Sudan with community-led humanitarian assistance, basically cooperatives of local communities who are basically organizing themselves to help those that are under attack. This is not happening because the UN came in and told them to do so. When you see people in places like Gaza or the DRC also putting themselves on the line to try to help neighbors, to try to bring women and girls to safe locations, to protect them from sexual violence. This is not necessarily happening because somebody became an expert on protection of civilians. It's happening because somebody chose to do it. And no one is more aware of the risks, physical risks, security risks, political retribution risks that they expose themselves to than the people who take the first step. It's really up to us. It's really up to us individually to decide what is the way in which we feel safe, but also confident that we are being as solidarious as we can be. And it's an ethical choice. It's a very personal choice. People's circumstances matter a huge deal. I don't think that there can be an answer that as a matter of principle, everybody should behave in a certain way. These are really, really tough choices. But I do think that solidarity is contagious. And if you can join up then I think that's the way to stay a little bit more protected. There's no need for people to go at it alone. There's many ways of getting together at the community level uh, and beyond to help others. So I would just encourage, whether you are pursuing a career in humanitarian assistance or not, if you have that impulse, don't give it up, because I also believe fundamentally that when you help another person, you build a human connection, and that human connection creates power in society. And it's in breaking that bond, it's in breaking that capacity that we have to help another person, that hopelessness tends to surge and to spread. So solidarity, practicing solidarity, is also a way of um, reclaiming power, reclaiming agency. And I think that when it is done for legitimate reasons, we should at least ask ourselves the question: Are we doing enough?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And really thank you for also that point about, we don't need to do advocacy alone. We can be part of a community. We can be part of solidarity. And really, this is the last question, Juan. If you could just share your thoughts in a couple of minutes. Could transparency around funding flows expose uncomfortable dependencies that the sector isn't ready to confront?
Could you kindly repeat a little bit? I was struggling to hear that part.
Could transparency around funding flows expose uncomfortable dependencies that the sector is not ready to confront?
Um, I I guess that's a mistake in the right direction that we should be willing to make. I think the principle of good faith in humanitarian action is really quite important. Um, I think, given the circumstances, the sector has been under tremendous pressure to hyper prioritize. We know that more than 300 million people need humanitarian assistance, and yet, we had to take a very very hard look at how many of those can we realistically help, and who are the most severely affected, and can we just at least focus on that first. So I don't think this is an issue that resolves itself simply through looking at funding flows in a cold assessment of numbers doesn't reveal the full story. And of course, where there are cases where either dependencies are being deepened, or the use of funds is not being done efficiently enough, those corrections need to happen. A conversation needs to happen when that is observed. But I think the principle of good faith needs to prevail. Fundamentally, this is about life or death for many people. I think there's wider conversations to be had about more structural issues, and how this is a more structural problem. In a way, humanitarian aid is at the margins or at the periphery of systems that run a little more deeper, right? So I think this is more a question about things like fiscal policy, how governments construct their budgets, how much is being invested in human development. I think the idea of dependency on aid, and especially humanitarian aid, is a very, very tricky thing to examine on the basis of cold numbers alone. I think there's so many different questions that branch out from that question that I think, at the end of the day, what I would say is, regardless of all of that, or regardless of that concern, radical transparency is always a good policy. Radical transparency about what money is flowing, where, and for what. has to be there for accountability, for course correction. These are not things that we should do to look good on paper and be able to fundraise more efficiently. These are things that we need to do to collect clear data points, to learn and improve and question ourselves and just keep doing better. So I think, I guess to round it up, I'm saying two things. Number one, numbers don't tell the full story. But number two, there has to be full transparency on the numbers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Juan. Thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. Giving us a lot to think about. And I really appreciate the care, thoughtfulness, wisdom, and honesty you've engaged with this quite complicated question, and that is still developing in real time. We'll end it here and invite our participants we've put the link to the listening channel. Please, this is also an invitation for you to be part of the conversation in looking at the future of humanitarian work. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks everybody.